Hey everybody. This is part 4, or the video 4, of part 2 of Negative Dialectics. Part 2 of Negative Dialectics by Adorno is titled Negative Dialectics Concept and Categories. So here we go. The first section is titled The Object's Preponderance. Carried through, the critique of identity is a groping for the preponderance of the object. Identitarian thinking is subjectivistic even when it denies being so. To revise that kind of thinking, to debit identity with untruth, does not bring subject and object into a balance, nor does it raise the concept of function to an exclusively dominant role in cognition. Even when we merely limit the subject, we put an end to its power. Its own absoluteness is the measure by which the least surplus of non-identity feels to the subject like an absolute threat. A minimum will do to spoil it as a whole because it pretends to be the whole. Subjectivity changes its quality in a context which it is unable to evolve on its own. Due to the inequality inherent in the concept of mediation, the subject enters into the object altogether differently from the way the object enters into the subject. An object can be conceived only by a subject, but always remains something other than the subject, whereas a subject by its very nature is from the outset an object as well. Not even as an idea can we conceive a subject that is not an object, but we can conceive an object that is not a subject. To be an object also is part of the meaning of subjectivity, but it is not equally part of the meaning of objectivity to be a subject. That the I is an entity, is implicit even in the sense of the logical, quote, I think, which should be able to accompany all my conceptions, end quote. Because the sequence of time is a condition of its possibility, and there is no sequence of time save in temporality. The pronoun, quote, my, points to a subject as an object among objects. And again, without this, quote, my, there would be no, quote, I think. The being of a subject is taken from objectivity, a fact that lends a touch of objectivity to the subject itself. It is not by chance that the Latin word subjectum, the underlying, reminds us of the very thing which the technical language of philosophy has come to call, quote, objective. The word, quote, object, on the other hand, is not related to subjectivity until we reflect upon the possibility of its definition. This does not mean that objectivity is something immediate, that we might forget our critique of naive realism. To grant precedence to the object means to make progressive, qualitative distinctions between things which in themselves are indirect. It means a moment in dialectics, not beyond dialectics, but articulated in dialectics. Kant still refused to be talked out of the moment of objective preponderance. Kant used an objective intention to direct the subjective analysis of the cognitive faculty in his critique of pure reason, and he stubbornly defended the transcendent thing in itself. Footnote: literally, the preponderance of the object might be traced back to the point where a thought believes it has won its own absolute objectivity by rejecting any objectivity that is not thought. In other words, to formal logic. The, quote, something to which all logical propositions refer, even when they are free to ignore it entirely, is a copy of that which a thought means and without which it could not be. The non-cognitive is a logically immanent condition of the cogitative. In fact, the copula, quote, is, always conveys some objectivity already after the model of existential judgments. This disposes of all the hopes kindled by our craving for security, that in formal logic we might possess something downright unconditional as the sure foundation of philosophy. End footnote. To Kant, it was evident that being in itself did not run counter to the concept of an object, that the subjective indirectness of that concept is to be laid less to the subject's idea than to the subject's insufficiency. The object cannot get beyond itself for Kant either, but he does not sacrifice the idea of otherness. Without otherness, cognition would deteriorate into tautology. What is known would be knowledge itself. To Kant's mediation, this was clearly more irksome than the inconsistency of the thing in itself, being the unknown cause of phenomena, even though the category of causality ends up on the subject side in his critique of reason. The construction of transcendental subjectivity was a magnificently paradoxical and fallible effort to master the object in its opposite pole, but in this respect too, the accomplishment of what was merely proclaimed in positive idealistic dialectics requires a critique of that conclusion. An ontological moment is needed insofar as ontology will critically strip the subject of its cogently constitutive role without substituting it through the object in a kind of second immediacy. The object's preponderance is solely attainable for subjective reflection, and for reflection on the subject. The state of facts is difficult to reconcile with the rules of current logic, and absurd in its abstract expression. It may clarify it to consider that one might write in a primeval history of the subject, as outlined in Dialectic of Enlightenment, but one cannot write a primeval history of the object. Any such history would be dealing with specific objects. Nor does an ontological supremacy of consciousness follow from the counter-argument that without a knowing subject, nothing can be known about the object. Every statement to the effect that subjectivity, quote, is, no matter what or how, includes an objectivity which the subject, by means of its absolute being, claims to have yet to establish. Only because the subject in turn is indirect, because it is not the radical otherness required to legitimize the object, is it capable of grasping objectivity at all. Rather than constitutive for objectivity, the subjective mediation is a block to objectivity. It fails to absorb entity, which objectivity is in essence. Genetically, the consciousness that has achieved independence, the epitome of what is done in cognitive performance, has branched off from the libidinous energy of the species. Human nature is not indifferent to this. It certainly does not define a, quote, sphere of absolute origins, end quote, as Husserl thought. Consciousness is a function of the living subject, and no exorcism will expel this from the concept's meaning. The objection that in the process the empirical moment of subjectivity would be mixed with its transcendental or essential moment is a feeble one. Without any relation to an empirical consciousness, to the living I, there would be no transcendental, purely mental consciousness. Analogous reflections on the object's genesis would be meaningless. Mediation of the object means that it must not be statically, dogmatically hypostatized, but can be known only as it entwines with subjectivity. Mediation of the subject means that without the moment of objectivity, it would be literally nil. An index of the object's preponderance is the impotence of the mind, in all its judgments as well as, to this day, in the organization of reality. The negative fact that the mind, failing in identification, has also failed in reconcilement, that its supremacy has miscarried, becomes the motor of its disenchantment. The human mind is both true and a mirage. It is true because nothing is exempt from the dominance which it has brought into pure form. It is untrue because, interlocked with dominance, it is anything but the mind it believes and claims to be. Enlightenment thus transcends its traditional self-understanding. It is demythologization, no longer merely as a reductio ad hominem, but the other way around, as a reductio hominis, an insight into the delusion of the subject that will style itself an absolute. The subject is the late form of the myth, and yet the equal of its oldest form. New section. The object not a datum. That the object takes precedence even though indirect itself does not cut off the subject-object dialectics. Immediacy is no more beyond dialectics than is mediation. Epistemological tradition places anything immediate on the subject side, but as the subject's datum or affection. The subject is said to have power to shape immediacy insofar as it is autonomous and spontaneous, but to be powerless insofar as the directly given thing flatly exists. The direct datum is as much the basic fact on which the doctrine of subjectivity rested, the doctrine of, quote, mind, of the subject's substance as its possession, and it is the form of a kind of objective resistance, the mene tekel, as it were, of objectivity within the subject. This is why Hume, in the name of immediacy, criticized identity. The principle of that I would like to maintain itself as autochthonous in the face of immediacy. Yet immediacy cannot be fixed so as to please an epistemology gauged to standards of conclusiveness. In immediacy, the direct datum and the equally directly given forms are tailored so as to complement each other. Immediacy calls a halt to the idolatry of derivation, but it is also something abstracted from the object, a raw material for the subjective process of production that served as a model for epistemology. What is given in poor and blind form is not objectivity. It is merely the borderline value which the subject, having confiscated the concrete object, cannot fully master in its own domain. Here, for all its sensualistic reduction of things, empiricism registered some of the object's preponderance. From Locke onward, empiricists would insist that there is no content of consciousness other than that which comes from the senses, is, quote, given. The entire empiricist critique of naive realism, culminating in Hume's abolition of the thing, was tied to the factitious character of immediacy and skeptical of the subject qua creator. In spite of everything, it remained rudimentarily, quote, realistic. One thought has been freed from the supposition of the subject's supremacy. However, empiricist epistemology is no longer entitled to transpose, as a residual definition, a kind of minimum object into the direct data by means of subjective reduction. Such a construction is nothing but a compromise between the dogma of the subject's preponderance and the impossibility to carry it through. The naked sense datum, divested of its definitions, is a product of that process, of abstraction with which it is contrasted by Kant's epistemological subjectivism, and indeed the more purified of its forms, the scantier and the more, quote, abstract the datum. The object's residue is that which remains given after subjective appendages have been subtracted is a delusion of prima philosophia. That the definitions which make the object concrete are merely imposed upon it, this rule applies only where the faith in the primacy of subjectivity remains unshaken. But the forms of subjectivity are not cognitive ultimates, as Kant taught. As its experience progresses, cognition can break through them. If philosophy, fatally split off from the natural science, may refer to physics at all without causing a short circuit, it may do so in this context. With theoretical stringency, the evolution of physics since Einstein has burst the visual prison, as well as that of the subjective a priority of space, time, and causality. In teaching the possibility of such a prison break, experience, subjective, according to the Newtonian principle of observation, argues for the primacy of the object and against its own omnipotence. Involuntarily dialectical in spirit, it turns subjective observation against the doctrine of subjective constituents. The object is more than purely factuality. At the same time, the fact that factuality is irremovable forbids contentment with its abstract concept and with the dregs of factuality, the recorded sense data. The idea of a concrete object belongs to the critique of subjective external categorization and to the critique of its correlate, the fiction of a factuality without definitions. Nothing in the world is composed, added up, so to speak, of factuality and concept. The probative force of the Kantian example of the 100 imagined thalers. The probative force of the Kantian example of the 100 imagined thalers, which I think thalers are like Prussian money or something like that. I'm not sure. Whose reality is not added to them as a further reality. Jesus Christ. Fucking this sentence up. The probative force of the Kantian example of the 100 imagined thalers, whose reality is not added to them as a further quality, affects the form-substance dualism of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the book itself, and remains a force acting far beyond the example. What it really does is to disavow the distinction of diversity and unity which traditional philosophy has been making since Plato. Neither the concept nor factuality is an addition to its complement. Hegel's presupposition that the subject might yield purely, unreservedly to the object, to the thing itself, since the process would show the thing to be what it already is in itself, a subject. This presupposition is presumptuously idealistic, but it does take note, against idealism, of a truth about the subject's mode of cogitative conduct. Because the subject does not make the object, it can really only, quote, look on, end quote, and the cognitive maxim is to assist in that process. The measure of the subject's postulated passivity is the object's objective determination, but this determination needs a subjective reflection more lasting than the identifications of which Kant already taught that consciousness performs them, as it were, unconsciously and automatically, that the activity of the mind, and even more the activity which Kant ascribes to the problem of constitution, is something other than the automatism he equates it with. This specifically makes out the mental experience which the idealist discovered, albeit only in order to castrate it on the spot. What we may call the thing itself is not positively and immediately at hand. He who wants to know it must think more, not less, than the point of reference of the synthesis of diversity, which is the same at bottom as not to think at all. And yet the thing itself is by no means a thought product. It is non-identity through identity. Such non-identity is not a, quote, idea, but it is an adjunct. The experiencing subject strives to disappear in it. The truth would be its demise, a demise merely feigned, to the greater glory of the subject objectified in a scientific method, by the subtraction of all specific subjectivity in that method. New section. Objectivity and reification. Preponderance of the object is thought of, which any the preponderance of the object is a thought of which any pretentious philosophy will be suspicious. Since Fichte, aversion to it has been institutionalized. Protestations to the contrary, reiterated and varied 1,000-fold, seek to drown out the festering suspicion that heteronomy may be mightier than the autonomy of which Kant already taught that it cannot be conquered by that superior power. Such philosophical subjectivism is the ideological accompaniment of the emancipation of the bourgeois I. It furnishes reasons for that emancipation. Its tenacious vigor is drawn from a misdirected opposition to the status quo, from opposition to its thingness. In relativizing or liquefying that thingness, philosophy believes to be above the supremacy of goods and above the form of subjective reflection on that supremacy, the reified consciousness. In Fichte, that impulse is as unmistakable as the urge to universal rule. It was an anti-ideological impulse insofar as the world's being in itself, confirmed by a conventional unreflected consciousness, was seen through as merely manufactured and unfit for self-preservation. Despite the preponderance of the object, the thingness of the world is also phenomenal. It tempts the subjects to ascribe their own social circumstances of production to the noumena. That's a really fascinating sentence. Despite the preponderance of the object, the thingness of the world is also phenomenal. It tempts the subject to ascribe their own social circumstances of the production to the noumena. And if you, to my understanding, at least if I'm recalling my very little knowledge of German philosophy in the early 19th and late 18th centuries, the noumena refers to like the transcendental thing in itself, which refers to things as they are outside of space and time, and outside of what can be scientifically knowable about the world, that which is necessarily spatio-temporal. So it's like this is a very deep critique of the ontologization of the capitalist mode of production in a very interesting way that I've never read before. I'm not explaining what I noumena well, but I'm also not an expert on the topic, so let's move on. This is elaborated in Marx's chapter on fetishes, truly a piece from the heritages of classic German philosophy. Even its systematic motive survives in that chapter. The fetish character of goods is not laid to a subjectively errant consciousness, but objectively deduced from the social a priori, the exchange process. Marx already expresses the difference between the object's preponderance as a product of criticism and its extant caricature its distortion by the merchandise character. Barter as a process has real objectivity and is objectively untrue at the same time, transgressing against its own principle, the principle of equality. This is why of necessity it will create a false consciousness, the idols of the market. It is only in a sardonic sense that the barter society's natural growth is a law of nature, that the predominance of economics is no invariant. The thinker may easily comfort himself by imagining that in the dissolution of reification, of the merchandise character he possesses the philosopher's stone. But reification itself is the reflexive form of false objectivity, centering theory around reification, a form of consciousness, makes the critical theory idealistically acceptable to the reigning consciousness and to the collective unconscious. That is what raised Marx's early writings, in contradistinction to Das Kapital, to their present popularity, notably with theologians. There is a good deal of irony in the fact that the brutal and primitive functionaries who more than 40 years back damned Lukács as a heretic because of the reification chapter in his important History and Class Consciousness did sense the idealistic nature of his conception. We can no more reduce dialectics to reification than we can reduce dialectics to any other isolated category, however polemical. The cause of human suffering, meanwhile, will be glossed over rather than denounced in the lament about reification. The trouble is with the conditions that condemn mankind to impotence and apathy and would yet be changeable by human action. It is not primarily with people and with the way conditions appear to people. Considering the possibility of total disaster, reification is an epiphenomenon. And even more so is the alienation coupled with reification, the subjective state of consciousness that corresponds to it. Alienation is reproduced by anxiety, consciousness, reified in the already constituted society. It is not the constituents of anxiety. If a man looks upon thingness as radical evil, if he would like to dynamize all entity into pure actuality, he tends to be hostile to otherness and to the alien thing that has lent its name to alienation, and not in vain. He tends to that non-identity which would be the deliverance, not of consciousness alone, but of reconciled mankind. Absolute dynamics, on the other hand, would be that absolute action whose violent satisfaction lies in itself, the action in which non-identity is abused as a mere occasion. Unbroken and all too human slogans lend themselves to new equations between the subject and what is not its like. Things congeal as fragments of that which was subjugated. To rescue it means to love things. We cannot eliminate from the dialectics of the extent what is experienced in consciousness as an alien thing. Negatively, coercion and heteronomy, but also the marred figure of what we should love, and what the spell, the endogamy of consciousness, does not permit us to love. The reconciled condition would not be the philosophical imperialism of annexing the alien. Instead, its happiness would lie in the fact that the alien, in the proximity it is granted, remains what is distant and different, beyond the heterogeneous and beyond that which is one's own. The tireless charge of reification resists that dialectics, and this indicts the constructions used in the philosophy of history to back up that charge. The meaningful times for whose return the early Lukács yearned were as much due to reification, to inhuman institutions, as Lukács would later attest it only to the bourgeois age. Contemporary representations of medieval towns usually look as if an execution were just taking place to cheer the populace. If any harmony of subject and object should have prevailed in those days, It was a harmony like the most recent one, pressure-born and brittle. The transfiguration of past conditions serves the purpose of a late, superfluous denial that is experienced as a no-exit situation. Only as lost conditions do they become glamorous. Their cult, the cult of pre-subjective phases, arose in horror in the age of individual disintegration and collective regression. With the delivery of the natural sciences, reification and reified consciousness also brought about the possibility of worldwide freedom from want. Even earlier, humanity was conditioned by dehumanized things. At least it went hand in hand with reified forms of consciousness. While indifference to things, appraising them as mere means and reducing them to the subject, helped to tear down humanity. In the realm of things, there is an intermingling of both the object's unidentical side and the submission of men to prevailing conditions of production, to their own functional context which they cannot know. The mature Marx, in his few remarks on the character of a liberated society, changed his position on the cause of reification, the division of labor. He now distinguishes the state of freedom from original immediacy. In the moment of planning, the result of which he hoped would be production for use by the living rather than for profit, and thus in a sense a restitution of immediacy, is that in that planning he preserved the alien thing. In his design for a realization of what philosophy had only thought at first, he preserved its mediation. But that there could be no dialectics without the element of solid things, that without such things it would level off into a harmless doctrine of change, this was attributable neither to philosophical habit nor solely to the social compulsion of which consciousness receives such solid knowledge. It is up to philosophy to think the things which differ from the thought and yet make it a thought exclusively, while their demon seeks to persuade the thought that it ought not to be. Okay, and that is the end of part 4, or video 4, of part 2 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics, part 2 being titled Negative Dialectics, Concept and Categories. There's going to be one more video for part 2, and it starts with a passage titled Passage to Materialism. Thank you so much for listening.